They found the Emperor's sons in the dark between stars. After 10,000 years, they found them. I know because I filed the paperwork. My name is Archivist-Seneschal Tomas Crane. I served the Departamento Chroniclum for 31 years. I catalogued the movements of fleets, the births of saints, the deaths of worlds. I believed every entry I made was a small act of devotion. I believed the record was sacred. Then they handed me a file that should not exist, a file about 2 Primarchs, whose names have been redacted from every Imperial record for 10 millennia. A file that told me they were coming home. I didn't know then that understanding what I was reading would cost me everything. That the joy I felt in that moment, that surge of something close to faith restored, was the most dangerous thing I had ever felt, because joy makes you careless. And carelessness in the Imperium of man is a death warrant already signed. My name is Tomas Crane, and this is how I learned that some silences are not broken. They are merely paused. I should tell you who I was before I tell you what I found. For 3 decades, I served in the Departamento Chroniclum's Stellar Cartography and Personage Division, specifically the subsection responsible for maintaining the lineages of what are called mythic personages, which is the bureaucratic designation for individuals whose historical significance is considered so vast that their records require specialist handling. The classification exists for saints, for legendary commanders, for figures who have passed into something between history and theology. It exists, though no living soul in my division was supposed to know this, for the Primarchs. I worked in the secondary archive on level 47 of the Chroniclum's North Spire on Terra. The archive was kept at 11 degrees, cold enough to preserve parchment, cold enough that I wore the same gray woolen undergarment beneath my robes every day from the 3rd month of service until retirement was a distant dream I still permitted myself. The smell of the place was vellum and dust, and the faint chemical sharpness of preservation fluid, a smell so constant and so specific that I stopped noticing it for years, and only remembered it much later. When I was somewhere very different and could no longer smell anything like it at all, my access level was Gamma 7, high enough to handle classified personage files. Not high enough, according to every authorization matrix I'd ever seen, to touch records classified above Phi Sigma Eternal, which was the designation applied to materials concerning the Emperor himself and his immediate lineage. The Primarchs, all 20 of them, were Phi Sigma Eternal. I had never, in 31 years, touched a Phi Sigma Eternal file. I understood this to be correct. I understood my access level to be not a limitation, but a mercy. Some knowledge, the Chroniclum taught, was not meant to be carried by mortal minds. Some truths could only be approached by the properly consecrated, the properly authorized, the properly prepared. I was Gamma 7. I was prepared for a great deal, but not for that. I want you to understand that I was not naive. I was a 31-year veteran of the most rigorous archival institution in the Imperium. I had catalogued famines and purges in the aftermath of exterminatus orders. I had handled files on saints who died screaming, and heroes who were quietly expunged from the record when their loyalties became inconvenient. I knew the Imperium was not the luminous edifice painted in recruitment murals. I knew it was a machine, and machines grind, and grinding requires grist. But I believed in the machine. I believed it was necessary. I believed that the Emperor, even entombed on the golden throne for 10,000 years, still willed this instrument into motion for reasons beyond my comprehension. My faith was not simple. It was not comfortable. It was the faith of someone who has looked at the evidence and decided that, on balance, whatever comes after this must be worth what this costs. That was who I was on the morning they gave me the file. The archivist who delivered it was a junior named Pren. She was 23 and still wore the slightly startled expression of someone who had not yet accepted that this was what work felt like forever. She set the sealed casing on my desk at the 7th hour, 17 minutes past the morning bell, and told me it had come through priority vermilion channels, cleared for my access, and that I was to treat it as routine personage intake. Priority vermilion is not routine, I told her. The memo says to treat it as routine, she said, and left. I held the case for a long moment before opening it. The seal was intact. The authorization codes were valid. My name was in the address field, Archivist-Seneschal Tomas Crane. Gamma 7 clearance. For intake and preliminary cataloging, the classification marker on the file inside read Phi Sigma Eternal. Someone had cleared me for Phi Sigma Eternal access. Someone very high. And they had sent me a personage file for what the header described, in the driest possible administrative language, as 2 Primarch class individuals. Designation Legionis Astartes. Status pending reintegration into Imperial command structure. Pending reintegration. I sat down. I don't remember deciding to sit down. I was simply sitting. The 2 Primarchs whose names had been cut from every record, whose legions had been disbanded and their lineage erased, and their histories redacted to such thorough completeness that most Imperial citizens did not know there had ever been 20 Primarchs, and not 18. Those 2 sons of the Emperor were being brought home, and someone had decided that the first step in that process was giving their file to a Gamma 7 archivist in the North Spire of the Departamento Chroniclum. I should have immediately flagged it for senior oversight. I did not. I started reading. That was my first mistake, not the last. I need to explain what the redaction of a Primarch means, because it is not a simple thing and it is not something most people ever think to question. When you erase a person from history, you are not merely removing their name. You are performing a kind of surgery on causality itself. Every event they touched must be reattributed or obscured. Every person who knew them must be silenced or redirected. Every world that bore their legion's mark must have that mark removed or reclassified. The erasure of 2 Primarchs from the Imperial record was an act of violence performed against 10,000 years of continuous history, and it required constant, ongoing maintenance. Every generation of scholars who might notice the inconsistencies must be guided away from them. Every archive that might contain evidence of the gap must be regularly audited and adjusted. This was not a secret kept. It was a secret maintained, actively, by people like me, though I had not known I was one of them until that morning. The file contained no names for the 2 Primarchs. It referred to them throughout as Subject Auric and Subject Sable, which I recognized as the kind of operational designations used when even the act of naming a thing in a document creates security vulnerabilities. Their names, the file noted in a footnote I had to read 3 times to believe, were still under deliberation at the highest levels of the Senatorum Imperialis. After 10,000 years, nobody had quite decided whether it was safe to speak those names out loud again. The file contained their physical descriptions, their last known locations at the time of whatever event had caused their removal from the historical record. The file was carefully, meticulously silent on the nature of that event. The section that should have explained the circumstances of their disappearance contained a single line: circumstances of removal classified above current access level. Proceed with intake documentation only. Proceed with intake documentation only. Someone wanted these 2 Primarchs entered into the living record. Someone wanted them to exist, bureaucratically speaking, before they existed officially. I was being asked to do preliminary paperwork for the return of 2 lost demigods of humanity, and I was not permitted to know why they had been lost in the first place. That should have been where I stopped. That should have been where I flagged it, closed the case, and sent a polite memorandum upward requesting clarification of my authorization parameters. But you must understand, I had spent 31 years in an archive. I had spent 31 years surrounded by history, maintaining it, caring for it, believing in its sanctity. And here was a gap in history so vast, so deliberate, so long maintained, that its edges had worn smooth from constant tending. 2 sons of the Emperor, 2 legions worth of warriors, traditions, campaigns, worlds, and names, scraped from the record with a thoroughness that bordered on the theological. I wanted to know why. Not recklessly, not carelessly. I simply had to know, the way a mathematician confronted with an equation that almost resolves but leaves one variable hanging cannot walk away until they find it. I began to dig. I want to be precise about what I did and what I did not do, because there are those who might call what followed an investigation, and I would call it something more involuntary than that. An investigation implies intent. What I experienced was more like following a thread, because it was already in my hand, and when I tried to put it down, I found it was attached to something. My Gamma 7 clearance, combined with the priority Vermilion authorization attached to the file, gave me access to a tier of records I had never touched before. Cross-referencing the physical descriptions of Subject Auric and Subject Sable against the Legiones Astartes historical registry, I found gaps, not unusual. Gaps in the registry are expected. 10,000 years of conflict, decay, and deliberate redaction leave voids everywhere. What caught my attention was the shape of these particular gaps. They were maintained, current. A historical gap that results from decay looks like damage. Torn parchment, faded ink, missing codices. A maintained gap looks different. It looks like a sealed door. The edges are clean. The surrounding documents reference the gap without acknowledging it, a kind of archival peripheral vision, trained by long practice to slide past certain shapes without registering them. I had developed this peripheral vision myself over 31 years without ever once being told to. That was the most unsettling realization, not that the gaps existed, but that my own trained instincts had been, without my knowledge or consent, one of the instruments of their maintenance. The second file I accessed was a legionary muster roll from M30, the Great Crusade era. I was specifically looking for troop dispositions that might give me context on the two lost Primarchs without touching the classified core of their story. The muster R all contained a reference to what was listed as the First Expedition Fleet, which history records as the very first coordinated expansion of the nascent Imperium's military forces under the Emperor's direct command. The fleet's composition was listed in careful detail: ships, companies, attached support personnel. At the foot of the second page, a notation: Primarch class commander attached. Classification, reference OBL, IQUE 9, ETE, RNAL, OBL, IQUE 9, ETE. RNAL was a classification I had never seen before. I cross-referenced it against every classification index available at my access level. Nothing. It did not exist in any schema I could locate. It was not a Phi Sigma Eternal subclassification. It was not related to any operational security framework I recognized. It was, as best I could determine, a classification that had been invented specifically for whatever the First Expedition Fleet had encountered. A classification so narrow in its application that its definition existed only in the documents it protected. I wrote the reference number on the back of a requisition form I had in my desk drawer, in the cramped hand I use when I do not want anyone glancing over my shoulder to be able to read what I am writing. The third document I found was not one I was looking for. The Chroniclum's Personage Division maintains what are called transition files, records created when a mythic personage changes status, moves from one category to another, from active to inactive, living to martyred, present to missing. Most of these are routine. I had processed hundreds of them over 31 years. The transition file for Subject Auric had been created in M31, not closed in M31, created in M31. The file was still open. I stared at that for a long time. The archive was cold. I could see my breath. On the desk in front of me was a transition file for a Primarch of the Space Marines that had been left open, unresolved, for 10,000 years. Not because the Chroniclum had forgotten to close it, but because, in all that time, nobody had been authorized to determine which category he now belonged to. He had simply been placed in a holding state, pending determination. For 10 millennia, I thought about that file, its patient incompleteness, the precise bureaucratic terror of it, for most of what remained of that working day. Then I went home to my chambers in the Spire's residential tier, ate a meal I could not taste, and did not sleep until the small hours of the morning, when exhaustion finally overruled everything else. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came on the fourth day. I want to explain what I found in that fourth day before I explain what it cost me, because the knowledge deserves to be articulated clearly, even if the articulation itself is dangerous. The Chroniclum's archive contains a subsection called the Contextual Continuity Registry, which is exactly as dry as it sounds, and which I had accessed perhaps twice in 31 years. Its purpose is to provide contextual framing for historical events that require understanding of parallel developments across multiple theaters or time periods. It is used primarily by senior historians producing formal analyses, not by intake archivists processing routine personage files. My priority Vermilion authorization, I discovered, extended to the contextual continuity registry. Someone had given me very broad access with this file. I still did not know why. The registry entry I found was not indexed under the Primarchs designations. It was indexed under a heading that translated roughly as the arrangement of silences, a phrase that sounded almost poetic, but was in the Chroniclum's cataloging schema entirely technical, referring to deliberate gaps in the accord maintained for reasons of institutional stability. Subsection: lineage discontinuity events. Cross-reference: Phi Sigma Eternal, OBL, IQUE, 9ETE, RNAL, and 17 other classification codes I did not recognize. The entry had last been updated 43 years ago. Before that, the previous update was 97 years prior. Before that, 112 years. The pattern held back through centuries. Someone returned to this entry every few generations, read it, and updated the timestamp. Nothing more. Just a confirmation that someone had read it and that the situation it described remained unchanged. I read it. The entry described, in language of such administrative neutrality, it required me to read certain passages 3 times to understand their full weight. The deliberate suppression of a lineage event in M31 affecting 2 of the 20 Primarchs of the Adeptus Astartes. The suppression was described not as an act of concealment, but as an act of protection. The 2 Primarchs had not died. They had not turned. They had not been killed. The entry used a word I had to look up in a pre-heresy lexicon: sequestered. They had been sequestered, removed from the theater of history for reasons the entry described as too variable to enumerate here, but generally pertaining to the stability of the developing Imperial project and the psychological and operational requirements of the Legiones Astartes following the events of the Istvan system, the psychological and operational requirements of the Space Marines following Istvan, following the Horus Heresy, following the death of brothers, following a war that broke humanity to its foundations. The Imperial project, the entry said with that calm professional distance I had spent 31 years cultivating myself, had determined that the return of 2 additional Primarchs to an already destabilized command structure, a structure already fracturing between Guilliman's primacy and the independent traditions of a dozen surviving legions, would introduce variables that could not be controlled. They had not been erased because they were traitors. They had not been erased because they were dangerous. They had been sequestered because they were viable, because they could, if present, have become focal points for dissent, for alternative visions of what the post-heresy Imperium should be. Because in the chaos of reconstruction, 2 more sons of the Emperor, each with their own perspectives and loyalties and traditions, represented a kind of instability that the architects of the new order did not feel they could manage. They had been put away, carefully, with full intention of retrieval at a later date, at a date when the Imperial project was stable enough to absorb the variable. That date, apparently, was now. I sat in the 11-degree archive reading that entry with the kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature. Then I thought about the transition file, left open for 10,000 years. I thought about subject Auric waiting in a holding state. I thought about the 63rd update to this entry, made 43 years ago by hands I would never know, confirming situation unchanged, return pending. I thought about 2 Primarchs, sons of the Emperor, witnesses to the Great Crusade, who had outlived Horus and every horror of the heresy and the Long War, waiting in some void between history and the present, while 10,000 years of humanity burned and suffered and endured, waiting to be told it was finally safe to come home. And I thought about what it meant that the decision to bring them home had been made now, in this age, in this broken and bleeding Imperium, with the Cicatrix Maledictum tearing the galaxy open and Primarch Guilliman returned to lead a crusade and the great rift-making cartographers weep. I thought about what kind of desperation required reaching back across 10,000 years to retrieve what had been so carefully set aside. I thought, They are not bringing them home because it is finally safe. They are bringing them home because there is nothing safe left. I need to tell you about the meeting because without it, everything that follows is incomprehensible. On the 7th day of my handling this file, a senior archivist named Valdis Morn came to my desk. Morn was 40 years my senior, which, in the chroniclum, means he had been ancient for as long as I had worked there, the kind of gray-faced permanent fixture that institutional life produces, someone so thoroughly part of the machinery that their individual identity has become inseparable from their function. He smelled of the same preservation fluid I did. He had been working in this building for longer than most planetary governors hold power. He sat in the chair beside my desk, without asking, and folded his hands and looked at the file in front of me and said, "You've been reading the registry." I said yes. He was quiet for a moment. His hands were perfectly still, the hands of someone who had trained stillness into themselves over decades of painstaking work. "How far did you get?" he asked, not as a question. I told him I had reached the section on reasons for sequestration. He nodded very slowly. "Then you understand why it was done." "I understand the rationale given," I said. "That is not the same as understanding." That was perhaps the most honest thing I had ever said to a superior in 31 years. Morn looked at me for a long moment with the expression of someone recalibrating an assessment. "The Primarchs," he said, "were not removed from history to protect secrets. They were removed to protect people." "Specify." "Callie, people who needed a clear story. People who needed to know what the Imperium was and what it required. In M32, M33, M34, even up to the present age, the answer to those questions was not stable enough to survive the variable of 2 additional Primarchs with their own answers. Do you understand what I mean by a variable?" I said I thought I did. "There were factions," he said, "after the heresy. Factions within the remaining loyal legions. Factions within the new chapters after the Codex was formalized. Factions in the Senatorum. Factions that believed Guilliman's vision for the Imperium was itself a kind of betrayal. That the administrative dream was a hollowing out of what the Emperor had originally intended. If 2 more Primarchs had been present, those factions would have had voices. Very powerful voices." He paused. His hands remained still. "The men who made the decision to sequester them believed they were preventing a civil war. Were they right?" I asked. Morn looked out through the archive's narrow window at the spire of another chroniclum tower, itself disappearing into Terra's eternal smog layer. "I've reviewed this entry 15 times in 40 years, he said. "I've asked myself that question every time. I don't know. That's my honest answer. I don't know if they were right. I know that the Imperium survived and that 2 Primarchs spent 10,000 years in circumstances the file does not describe. Whether one of those things caused the other, or whether the same desperation that made sequestration seem necessary would have manifested some other way regardless, I genuinely cannot tell you." He stood up then, with the careful economy of movement of someone with old bones. "You were given this file," he said, "because someone at a level above my knowledge decided that the intake archivist for the reintegration process should understand the full context, not just the present status, but the history. The decision was made that ignorant intake documentation serves no one." He straightened his robes. "You are not in trouble. You were authorized for everything you read, but I want you to understand what it means that you were authorized for it." He looked at me directly, for the first time in the conversation. His eyes were very old. They had the quality of eyes that had read too much for too long, not damaged but compressed, as though the volume of information they'd processed had made them dense. "You are now part of the maintenance of this," he said. "That is not a warning. It is a statement of fact. The record you are preparing will become part of the ongoing arrangement of silences, not to perpetuate the concealment, but to frame its end appropriately. You are helping determine how this story gets told." A long pause. "Take care. Some narratives, once released, move in directions their authors do not intend." Then he left. I sat in the cold archive for what I later calculated was 42 minutes, not reading, not writing, holding the question he had left me with like a piece of shrapnel I was afraid to remove. I should tell you what I did with the file. I should tell you how the intake documentation was eventually completed, how the records were properly structured, How two Primarchs returned to the formal ledger of Imperial history after 10,000 years of patient waiting in the holding state of someone else's decision. But that isn't really the story. The story is what happened after. The story is what it felt like to sit with the knowledge that two of the Emperor's sons had been set aside, not cast down, not corrupted, not lost to chaos or death or the grinding machinery of war, but gently, carefully, deliberately removed and placed in storage because the moment of history they inhabit was too fragile to contain them, and that the men who made that choice had believed, sincerely believed, that they were doing the necessary thing, the merciful thing. In their calculus, I have tried many times since to find the place where that decision became indefensible. I have not found it cleanly. The logic is complete. The Imperium, still reeling from the heresy, was not stable enough to integrate two more powerful individuals with their own visions and their own legitimacies. The chaos of the post-heresy age would have given those factions with grievances against Guilliman's codex enormously powerful figureheads. There could have been war. Another war after the worst war in human history. The architects of sequestration looked at the variables and chose a smaller cruelty to prevent a larger one. But here is what I cannot escape, what I have not been able to file away or resolve or cross-reference into comprehension. Two men, sons of the God Emperor, warriors who had fought at their father's side from the first breath of the Great Crusade, who had seen worlds born into the Imperium, who had lost brothers to chaos and treachery, who had survived everything the galaxy threw at them, and who were then, at the moment they might have been most needed, placed carefully out of reach. 10,000 years. The Long War, the Age of Apostasy, the War of the Beast, the Noctis Eterna, the Plague Wars, the Indomitus Crusade. Every catastrophe and every miracle. Every generation of humanity born into suffering and dying in service to an Imperium they never chose. Every space marine who knelt before statues of Primarchs whose lineage he carried and prayed to figures he had been told were gone. Perhaps returning, perhaps watching, from somewhere beyond death. Two of those figures were not beyond death. They were not gone. They were simply waiting, as the paperwork said, pending return. I have tried to understand what that waiting felt like from their side. The file is carefully silent on this. The file describes their circumstances at removal and their status at the point of reintegration request, and almost nothing in between. What the 10,000 years were like for Subject Auric and Subject Sable, the file does not say. Perhaps there are other files. Perhaps those files exist above my access level even now, even after everything. Perhaps no one asked. Perhaps no one thought to. The completed intake documentation was transmitted to priority Vermilion channels on the 42nd day of my handling the file. It was acknowledged immediately with an automated receipt that gave no information about who received it or what would be done with it, or when. I did not know, on that 42nd day, whether the Primarchs had already returned, whether they were already walking on Terra, already meeting with Guilliman, already processing the experience of being reinserted into history after 10,000 years of absence, whether the Chroniclum's formal paperwork was the last step in a process already complete, or the first step in one barely begun. The file gave no timeline. The file was, in the end, what it had always been: intake documentation, my part of the work. Prin found me still at my desk an hour after the transmission was confirmed, in the cold archive, with my hands folded in front of me and no document open before me. "Are you all right?" she asked. The slightly startled expression was still there. She had not yet learned that the work would eventually train it out of her. "I need you to understand something," I told her, which was not an answer to her question, but she had the grace to wait. "In this work, we maintain records so that history does not slip into darkness by accident. That is the purpose we are taught. The sanctity of the record, the preservation of truth. Sometimes," I said, "the record is maintained in order to preserve a silence, and the silence is maintained because someone, at some point, decided the silence was necessary, and they may have been right. The silence may have been necessary. The decision may have been, in its full context and its terrible arithmetic, the correct one. I looked at the closed case file on my desk, and you can know all of that. You can understand all the reasoning. You can accept the logic. I looked at her. She was 23 and still knew enough to find the work meaningful in uncomplicated ways. And still, I said, when you have completed the intake documentation for 2 of the Emperor's sons coming home after 10,000 years, and you have read the file that explains why they were gone so long, you find that there is no form in existence for what you feel. There is no classification for it. It exists outside the schema entirely. She looked at the case file, then at me. What does it feel like? She asked. I thought about that question for a long moment. About the transition file left open for 10,000 years, pending determination. About Morn's eyes. About the 63rd update to the registry entry, made 43 years ago by someone who had read everything I had read, and then returned to their desk and continued the work. It feels, I said at last, like the Imperium is doing what it has always done, surviving by a margin too narrow to measure, making choices so difficult they cannot be judged cleanly, paying costs that may or may not be the right costs. I stood up from my desk. I was suddenly very tired, and I cannot tell you, I said, whether they are coming home to be saved or to do the saving. Perhaps neither. Perhaps both. Perhaps the galaxy is too far broken for that distinction to hold. I picked up my gray woolen undergarment from where it had fallen off the back of my chair and folded it carefully. What I can tell you is that I completed the intake forms. Their names are in the ledger now, after 10,000 years. They are in the ledger. I put the forms away and sealed the case file and carried it to the submission vault in the hall, outside, and placed it in the proper receptacle with the proper certification, the way I had placed 10,000 documents over 31 years. One more record maintained. One more entry in the history of the Imperium of Man. Outside the archive, through the narrow window, Terra burned with its perpetual dark light. The smog layer swallowed the tops of the spires and made the planet look, as it always looked, like something too large and too old and too wounded to be fully understood. Somewhere in that city, or on a ship bearing toward it, or in a place the file had declined to describe, 2 men who remembered what humanity looked like before 10,000 years of darkness were being told they could finally come home. I do not know what they will find when they arrive. I do not know what they will think of what we have built in their absence. I do not know whether we have made them proud of us, or whether that question is one only the guilty ask. But the forms are filed. The transition file after 10,000 years is closed. I am Tomas Crane. I am an archivist. I maintain the record. The rest is beyond my access level. What follows was recorded as a personal addendum to the official intake documentation, unsigned, and discovered during a routine audit 6 months after the primary filing was confirmed. The addendum was not added to the official record. It was, per standard chroniclum procedure for unofficial editions, preserved separately in the contextual archive, where it remains available to those with the appropriate access. The chroniclum does not endorse or validate the personal reflections of its personnel. The record is the record. Interpretation is the province of those appointed to interpret. The work continues.